He said, yeah, we could have done something else, but that would have a whole set of consequences that I'm not willing to accept. So that's a clear policy trade-off, right? That of course doesn't end the debate. It was still a PR disaster for the government, because people don't necessarily accept that. They don't necessarily accept that the government has limits. As ordinary voters, you want them to solve everything, and you don't want to hear no as an answer. And politicians know that, so they will always try to push these limits, and they will try to lean very deep into these constraints and see if they cannot somehow find a hole in the wall to go through. And that's what we'll be talking a lot about, right? And politics has this capacity. Because if it's not policy, what else, right? Policy is the best way we have to change the structure that we're in. So if there's any situation in which you would have a chance to change the odds, it would be in politics. For example, you don't have money, but you could have new taxes, and then you have more money, things like that, right? So there's ways, or none of the things I'm going to list today are absolute constraints. It's just that they come at a cost. And that's interesting to understand. The other thing that's important to understand is that it's not because you have a plan that you can actually do it. In the, what they call the high modernist era, which is basically start of 20th century to 1960s, there was a lot of belief in politics, that politics could reshape the world. This is the time of the big different ideologies, right? And on an administrative level, the idea was that we as administrators, we just face certain problems in society, like education, like poverty, like crime. And if we can only understand these problems well enough, and especially measure them well enough, we can come with some kind of optimal answer, right? Fundamentally, it's a technical problem. Yeah, there's politics and people have opinions, but only one of them is going to be right, and we're going to figure out who that is, and then we're just going to do that, right? That's the idea, the more bureaucratic approach to problems, or the social scientific approach to problems. Seeing them as technical and come with technical solutions. The problem here is not that is necessarily wrong or impossible. That's a whole different debate, right? Then you get into these debates of, could a computer make political decisions, etc.? Is there an optimal scientific way, blah, blah, blah? I think no, but that doesn't matter. Even if there was an optimal way, even if we had the supercomputer that would tell us what to do, that doesn't mean we could actually do it. Because in a democracy, the leader doesn't just implement his will. It's not because he says, we're all going to do it now, that it stops. Otherwise, there would have been zero corruption in Mexico right now, right? The president says it every day. Apparently, a lot of people are not listening. So he doesn't actually have that type of power that he can just stop being corrupt, and everybody does it. So there's a lot of factors there. There are external factors, like the pandemia. We'll talk about that later, but later means another week. But Coneval came with their new numbers, and you can have a lot of good social policies, but if your economy shrinks to 20%, then that will not, you won't see the results of that, right? But also internal factors, as in maybe the people that you test certain thing with are just incompetent, right? You want to build a bridge, but the contractor is corrupt and makes it of mostly sand and not a lot of mortar, and it collapses. You don't control that. Plus, you can't even predict that far ahead with planning. You cannot, for example, very basic economic thing, you cannot predict the price of raw materials. You can, but that can change. The pandemic, for example, changed that. And then your whole budget doesn't fit anymore. Or you could have unintended consequences, right? That it triggers certain different problems, or sometimes your unintended consequences are positive things that still screw you in the end. For example, you have a new program, let's say Jóvenes Construyendo el Futuro, which I hope most of you think is at least a reasonable program. That program is, the budget of that program is an estimate of how many people would need it, right? Now, let's imagine that all young people, including all of you and everybody you know, would apply to this at the same time, and you can as a student. Then suddenly it doesn't work anymore because there's not enough money. And even if they had enough money, there's not enough places to put all these young people, right? They have place for 1 million people, not 20 million people. So your program is too successful and it still collapses. That's also possible, right? So there's a lot of things you don't control, and we're going to talk about that today. That was my introduction. I'm going to talk about 3 types of complaints. If I sound like I'm a bit hurried, it's because I am a bit hurried. I have to run after this class for politics. But we're going to talk about economical constraints, which is probably the beefiest part of this. We're going to talk about institutional constraints, and at the end, a little bit about politics, but mainly the first. So in the economic constraints, here you can see the top industrialists asking for money because they were going bankrupt, but actually turned out to be billions richer now after the pandemic. Economic constraints, to a certain extent, are obvious what this is about, right? In the most simple sense, economical restraints are about the budget, or about Hacienda, or about how much money you have to spend as a government. That puts rather obvious limits on what you can do. Now, what is less obvious, although still fairly simple, is how this is linked to other functions of the government, right? Basically, when a government wants to do policies, they have to take into account what I would call a triple budget trade-off, which is the triangle there. It's more complex than this, but there are 3 main factors which you cannot have all at the same time, or at least they will come at each other's cost. They're kind of zero-sum game. You have the budget and your deficit if you go over the budget, which you mostly do. You have taxes, which is the main way to increase the budget. And you have spending, which is what you need a budget for and what would threaten the budget, right? Now, if you want more budget, or if you want your budget balanced, if you don't want to deal with economical constraints, then you would either need to raise taxes, that's very obviously, of which there's many ways, right? You can look at that at the end maybe, or you can decrease your spending. The problem is, this is super self-evident. Now, the problem is that people don't want any of these options. If you'd ask people separately, not together, but separately, do you want lower taxes? They will say yes. Do you want less deficit? They will say yes. Do you want the government to do more? They will say yes. These 3 things cannot happen at the same time, right? You cannot have endless money coming in and more out and not go into debt. Or can you? We'll talk about that later. Generally, theoretically at least, you cannot, because it's supposed to be a zero-sum game. And though you have to choose 2, that's the point of this triangle. You have to choose 2. You can't have 3. So generally, you should either raise taxes or decrease spending, and then you can have a good budget. You could also choose spending and taxes and sacrifice budget, right? That is possible in our types of economies. But that has serious consequences. In the long term, it will make this trade-off even worse. You will have a smaller triangle in the long term to split. Because in the long term, you will have to pay back that deficit. You have to pay back the loans you have, which doesn't need to be external. It's not always from the IMF. You could also have debts with contractors, for example. You buy a bunch of stuff and you don't pay for it. And you have to pay for it later, right? That's another way of getting debt, also for government. But in the long run, you will have interest on that, you will owe more money, and you will have less for spending. And if it goes wrong, you have to raise taxes and cut spending, right? So you lose 2 out of 3. That's the gamble you take by not wanting to sacrifice. So then you cannot choose which 2 you pick anymore in the long run. That's a very orthodox view on it, right? That you should never go over the budget. That's very contested. By the way, do you hear me well? Yes? Okay, yes, I'm just rambling. In modern macroeconomics, in Keynesian macroeconomics, you could contest this and say that, well, but sometimes you need to go over the budget to invest in things, right? Things that will later on, like building a refinery, for example, or building a solar park, or building a new port. You make investments in things that will later make you more money. And that is true. And then my story isn't correct. Or you need to make investments when your economy is low to like reiterate the engine. But those cannot last forever, right? You cannot be permanently investing. At some point, your investment must be finished, and then you must catch a breath, and then a new cycle of investment can start. Otherwise, you will just have a linear deficit, and it will always get worse. So this is the simple way of explaining it, how budget constrains states. Of course, if you ever paid attention to politics, politicians don't want to hear this. They like to run away from this as much as they can, including conservative politicians who talk about this all day until they get into power, and then they instantly forget. So let's talk a bit about this, right? There are ways in which you could try to get around the budget besides asking for direct contributions. Because governments will always try to have it all three ways, including our own government. By the way, today I'm going to give a lot of examples from the 4T because that's what I know best. I'll try to include some other countries as well. So how do you do that? Well, the most simple way is to print money and use that money to pay off your debt. And so you won't accrue debts. This is possible under certain conditions. One of them is that you can actually print money because you have a national currency. In the case of Belgium, we cannot because we have the euro. That's decided centrally, right? We cannot print them because they're not printed in Belgium. If your economy uses the dollar, but you're not American, right? If you're one of these islands that uses the dollar, you can't do this because your central bank doesn't make dollars. But if you can, like we could, or the Americans can, you could use this. Generally, states don't do this. Well, US does it, but a lot of states, we don't do it often because this could go horribly wrong. It usually doesn't, but if it does go wrong, it's catastrophical because you will get high inflation. Other countries will panic because you have high inflation. They'll pull out all their assets. That will actually cause the higher inflation. And then you are down the drain. Usually it doesn't happen. It goes very slow, this type of inflation, right? But for a country like Mexico that has volatile currency, for Latin countries in general, they're quite scared of doing this. That's why you will see it more in richer northern countries that they will use this tactic, like in the United States. But for us, this is not very interesting. The other thing you could do, which is the favorite of neoliberal presidents, as were all our previous ones, is the sale of assets. You're going to sell things. So you're not going to increase the taxes. You're going to sell things the government owns. With that, you get money. That money goes into the budget, and that allows you to run a deficit without getting debt, which sounds smart on the very short term, right? This is neoliberal favorite thing to do because they want to both. They don't necessarily want to increase spending, but they want to lower taxes, but they don't want debt. So they're going to sell things. You can clearly see this with all presidents from de la Madrid on to Peña Nieto, not including Peña Nieto because they sold everything already. So Peña Nieto just got debt. He was like, I sold everything already. I'm just going to go and massively explode the debt. But before him, they would just sell things. It's like a hot air balloon that throws off sandbags to stay afloat, right? There's two problems with this. One is that it is cause and effect here are a bit confusing. In many cases, this is not the cause of debt. This is the goal. So you will first make debt, then you say, oh, we need to pay for this. Well, let's sell the oil, right? Let's sell the airports. Let's sell the ports. So often this pretense of budget is really an excuse to privatize because that was your plan all along. You don't have bigger budget deficit than you had last administration. You're just gonna say, well, we need to do something, or you lower taxes, then you win twice, right? The capitalist class wins twice. They get tax cuts and they get to buy companies for cheap and become billionaires. That you saw this, for example, in Greece, where you saw a very hard constraint on this. In Greece, you may be too young to have been super conscious of this, but in 2015, the communists won elections. Yay! I've told the story before, I think, for the first time in a long while. And they had all these plans, but then the IMF immediately body slammed them into the floor and said, you have to pay now. And they're like, wait, can we have a month? No, now, or you die. And they were like, no, but we don't want to die. And they first said, no, we're not going to do it. And then the IMF poked European Central Bank said, okay, we're not going to print money. So you literally have no money. You go to the bank, put in your bank account, can't take it out. So they were just stuck, and they had to, and the debt was 0% their fault, right? They just came to power with this existing, and they had to privatize everything. The other problem with this is that this will usually fail long term. Why? There's two types of things you could privatize. Either things that are profitable, in which case you obviously lose the profit, right? An obvious case here is oil, but also electricity or harbors, for example, or roads, right? Toll roads. You can privatize that, but then you forever lose that income. So this is not a good budget plan, right? Long term, you lose. Or you have things that cost you money, and that seems like a good idea in the short term, but you had them for a reason in the first place, right? If you sell them, you usually need to rent them back. For example, government offices, if you sell them once, that doesn't mean that all the people in there are going to work in the park, right? So you usually start renting the building you just sold. And after 10 years, you now lose money, right, on selling it. So this was a quick budget fix, and then you lose elections, and it's the next guy's problem. But at some point, that will come back to haunt you, because you will need to pay for it. If you sell a refinery, then you'll never see profits of it, and you need to pay for the refinery now because you're using it. So you will lose the money. So selling off assets usually does not work out. This was Greece's big argument. It said, okay, if we privatize electricity and our harbors, we can never make this money back. Like, we can pay you half the money we owe you, and we'll never, ever pay you the other half. And the IMF said, great, then you're in debt forever. Okay, Mr. Diego, what do you have to say?
Yeah, I have a question. Like, considering all the evidence that it's in there, like showing that this neoliberal regime doesn't really work in long term at all. Do you think that the plan, in fact, is to privatize, like they intentionally do this, or do you think that there are actually people that think that this is gonna work?
I think it's both. Ideologically, that is the plan. That's what it's about. That's the long-term plan of the lobbyists and the think tanks that work under that. They're constantly looking for excuses to privatize because they don't think the government should own anything. But on a presidential level, I don't think that is the plan. Like, I think it's the plan of people in the background. I think actual leaders usually are just dealing with crises, and they look at what solution fits their ideology. Although this is fairly obvious why this doesn't work, right? But you're in a crisis and you need to do something, and they will use that to push this through, and people will accept it because there's no other way, or it seems like there's no other way. That's the argument they will make. I know that answers your question a little bit, but like on a think tank level, this is the plan, yes, very explicitly. So I don't think presidents necessarily have this as an explicit goal. It's just something that, this rich guy offered me so many million in bribes if I privatize this, so let me do it. I think that's more the direct way of thinking. Now, there's other ways. You have the more socialist variant of this, which is the opposite. Here you're going to overspend on the budget and think you're going to make your money back. So this is public spending that is supposed to boost the economy, and if it boosts the economy, it's going to bring in tax revenue. An example of this are the stimulus checks that you saw in the United States, where they had the choice between either we give people money, they're going to waste it and spend it, but this is going to keep business alive, or we're not going to give people money, but then all these businesses are going bankrupt, and trying to deal, since we have unemployment insurance, we need to pay for all these unemployed people. And that will cost us even more money than giving people $1,000 now, right? Because we need to give them $1,000 every month. So it is actually better to spend more. Either it will offset some even bigger costs, that's the example I gave now, or you could reason, you have to be very strategic with that it actually is going to grow the economy. That you invest in key sectors, those key sectors are going to trigger some chain reaction, and that is going to lead to further growth, right? You try to push the first domino brick, that's then going to lead to more growth. That's a gamble, of course. The difference with the other one is that this gamble at least sometimes works. It doesn't always work, but there's various examples of governments doing this, like the stimulus checks, and this actually saving the ship. And other examples, sometimes it just fails, and you try to boost the economy, but it doesn't work, and it was wasted money. So the left variant of this works sometimes. It's something you could try to do. Again, if you can, right? If there is this strategic opportunity to push certain buttons and pull certain strings that you hope will trigger some kind of domino effect. Then you have the neoliberal variant of this, for which there's not much to say. This is the idea that tax cuts are going to raise the budget. As my smiley indicates, this is a completely empty box. This has, to my knowledge, never worked in any country. So the logic is this: we're going to cut taxes, right? Therefore, it'll be easier to do business. Therefore, there'll be more businesses. So we have more businesses paying taxes, and that's going to negate our loss in taxes, right? Now, tax cuts in themselves the first part of this premise is not wrong. Tax cuts can work to boost the economy. Trump did this, for example, and it was true. He did create more growth. However, what was not true that this would help the government budget. Tax cuts are always a loss for the government. You don't, in practice, you don't, or I don't know any example of a country where you actually make this money back because more people pay taxes. Also because they don't necessarily invest this money. They just cash out sometimes, right? They just retire with that money, and okay, or they buy back their own stocks, or there's many things you can do. So it boosts the economy, but the return on the budget is mostly accepted as a lie. But they'll still do it. They'll still use this theory. I just don't know of any situation in which it actually worked. Tax cuts always hurt the budget. And then you have the last variant, which is the Mexican one, the Austeridad Republicana, which is not Mexican, of course, but that's the one we are using, right? You've heard AMLO talk about this. If you look in big terms, what our government does with this triangle is that they're indeed trying to tempt it. They're not raising taxes, which is what they should do in a normal socialist state. Bernie Sanders would have done it, right? He would have asked you for your financial support directly. AMLO doesn't do this. It's weird for a socialist. But what did he do instead? He tried to increase spending or keep spending the same and reduce the deficit, which he did achieve, by cutting waste, by cutting on all kinds of things, mostly middlemen in the case of the Fourth Transformation. Fourth Transformation, one of the guiding principles of this policy in general is to cut out middle organizations. So if you have a benefit and you have an organization that provides that benefit, you cut that out, that organization, you give it directly to the people who want it, right? If you have, I know, fertilizers for farmers, now the government will directly give them fertilizer, not give that to a farmers organization that then is going to give it to them, right? But cut out middlemen. They did a lot of that, a lot of just, you can't have drivers anymore if you're not an executive. Reduces on wages of things and cut on corruption, right? And also increase tax revenue by increasing tax efficiency. That's where we make most of our money. We, so I'm talking to us for, where the government makes most of their money is because the SAT is up to 3 times better than it used to be in getting the money that is owed to them. Wait, Faye, let me finish my rant. I'll get to you. Now, why is this uncommon and why does this work in Mexico? And I think it does work. It's for the simple truth that to cut a lot of waste, you need a lot of waste, right? Only in a terribly inefficient country can you do this. You need a lot of corruption, you need a lot of tax dodging for this to be an option, right? Because there's a lot of money that is lost that you can now recuperate. In Finland, this would not work because there's less fraud, there is less corruption, and there is less waste, right? So we were in a very unique position in Mexico where you could actually get things done via this way because there was such enormous waste and corruption. But that's context specific, right? Ms. Sofia, sorry.
Like, does this apply to what happened with the fideicomisos? Or like no, like where they cut like the middle, they give it directly to the people?
That is the logic from their end here of why they do this.
Okay. Excellent.
So you see there's a lot, for example, there was a lot of drama about the cutting of the government, for example, of women shelters, right? What not reported is the government made almost 100 shelters for women. So instead of giving it to NGOs, they said, we're going to do this ourselves, and this is going to cost us less money, right? They marketed horribly, so the only thing you remember is the first part of the equation, not that they then used that money to make a lot of them. But that's the logic of cutting the middleman, which, by the way, politically is a disastrous thing to do because you're pissing off the middleman, their family, and everybody that knows them, right? Because people don't like change. This is another reason why you don't see this too often happening, but that's one thing you could do, yes. But on a very certain, and then you won't be able to do this in 10 years, right? Because there's, these things have disappeared. So,
Doctor, and
yes.
like, do you have a Mexican example for the sale of assets? Because if I'm honest, I didn't understand pretty well. But do you have any Mexican example?
All privatizations. Privatization of the oil, privatization of telecom, privatization of the mines, privatization of Televisa, privatization of banks, of the post, all these things.
All the privatization.
Yeah, of refineries, right? It's truly ridiculous things they've done in the past. Like they sold part of a refinery. So you have a refinery, you have a bunch of machines. They were like, we're privatizing that machine. And so, like, now the rich guy owns that machine and the government needs to hire it back from him. Like, this is accounting trickery that they did, where long-term is just a mess. And that's why you saw, although I think Peña Nieto was probably, it's very controversial, I would say the best president after AMLO. In the sense of he got stuff done, but his budget exploded because the bill of all these privatizations came by that time. All the guys before him did, right? Because they had to pay so much in renting back stuff and paying for services that it was a disaster in the end. I shouldn't say Peña Nieto, but his administration, people in his administration got some things done. But they were at the end of this wave of sale of assets. Anyway, those are some things. Now, moving on. There's more than just the budget to this, right? If we talk about economical constraints. Part of talking about this, certain economic constraints also in your head, in the sense that you think that there's no money for something, right? There's a difference between if you actually have economic constraints and how you think it is. For example, neoliberal policies and conservative politicians will often stress this idea of economic constraints. They'll say there is no money, there's nothing we can do for you, right? Or they'll say there is no money, which might be true, but the only way to deal with this is to sell everything, right? Which I just demonstrate is not true, right? Or you could just raise taxes, especially in Mexico. That would be a very easy solution. So it is still a political game, the framing of these limits and how hard they are, right? On the other hand, the people might not understand these limits even exist, or they won't accept them, right? It also depends on politics. For example, for the fourth transformation, this story is a very hard story to sell because it goes against what socialists normally do, right? And the people in that party even don't agree necessarily with all of these things. So people might not understand economical constraints, right? So because these constraints are sometimes bigger than just the budget. Let me talk about just a few. One of them is imports, right? You might want to buy something that you have money for that you cannot buy because it's limited, right? You have hard resource problems. You might need certain materials, for example, syringes to do vaccines that you just can't get. In Cuba's case, because you cannot trade with countries. In other countries' cases, because maybe they're sold out or something, right? And that's something that's sometimes hard for people to understand. You saw this with the vaccines. People are like, oh, well, why not all these vaccines like in America? Well, they should spend more money on it. No, is that they buy all they can, and there's only so many for sale, right? So you have to wait till this comes in. That is not a budget problem, that's just a market problem. Could also be that the problem is not your budget as a state, the problem is that everybody else is broke, right? Like your citizens have no money, or your citizens are in debt. So certain things will not work in your country. You cannot count on them. You could, for example, finance certain debt by selling shares to your own population, which in a country where nobody has money doesn't work, right? But in Belgium, most of Belgium's debt is internal debt. Almost all of our debt is owned to citizens. Our government primarily loans from its own people. But that requires a culture of people who save a lot of money. We're cheap in Belgium. They won't admit it, but we are. I certainly am. But anyway, we tend to save money. Unlike the Americans, for example, big difference in culture, right? People generally don't have credit cards in Belgium. You don't use credit cards to buy things. So that the government can then try to get that money from you, right? But that's only true if you have that type of population or you have the purchase power for it. If you have a large poor population like Mexico, there's a lot you cannot do. Same with the labor market. This is a very big topic that I should not talk more about in 2 minutes. But your labor market is enormously influential on your policies. For example, your unemployment levels, right? If you have very high employment, like 99%, to say it easier, if you have only 1% unemployment, you can skip on certain social policies that you don't need to have because it's so easy to find work. You don't need unemployment insurance, for example. Mexico historically has high employment. So one of the reasons why we never really developed this, and now that is changing, there's many things, and now that becomes more interesting. Another thing is informality, right? A lot of Western ideas don't work here because more than half the people are hiding their income from the government, right? Usually not intentionally because they don't have a formal job. But that means that the government cannot do a lot of things. For example, if the government says, okay, let's help the people, right? Let's give them stimulus checks. How do you do it in the US? If you have a social security number, here, half the people don't have a social security number. So how are you gonna even, like, if you would have to give the money, how are you gonna do it? Stand on the street corner at the OXXO and like hand people money? Because the people are not registered with the government or with the SAT. So you don't even know that they exist, right? So there's a lot of things that we should do but cannot do because of how informal a labor market is. And other things like currency markets, etc. That gets too complex, that are unpredictable, that screw with your budget. So economic constraints they're bigger than the budget. There's other things, but budget is the easiest thing to talk about here. Any questions so far before I move further? We'll get back to labor market when we get to social policy, but this truly screws us. And if you could formalize labor, that would solve half the problems in Mexico. The state would be rolling in money. Everybody would get their benefits. It would be great, but well, that's one of the things the state does not control, unfortunately. No questions? Good. Then we plow forwards and talk about institutional constraints. One day you will understand why I put pinball machine here. Institutions. What are institutions? Let me ask you that. What's an institution?
It's an organization that is, well, it's a government organization, and that is organized in a way that there is certain hierarchy, and well, it depends most of the times from a higher direction. That's what I have understood for an
That
institution.
is part of it. That's an example of what institutions are. It's more an institute that you're describing. I know this sounds weird, but institutions are basically habits of organization, you could call it. Institutions are the ways we are used to doing things, so the accepted ways of organizing, and organizing means relating to each other. For example, it's an institution that I'm the teacher and you're the student, and that I talk most of the time, right? We generally expect this in this class, that that's going to happen. Now, if you formalize that and you put government money behind it, then you get what you say, and you get an institute, and a government organization. But institutions, in the larger sense, are just accepted ways of organization, or expected ways of organization, which doesn't need to be the government, right? You could, for example, the family is an institution too, right? Because you have a certain structure of how people live together, and that's expected. Now, institutional constraints then are constraints that exist because we have organized a certain way. And the shape which your organization has taken already limits what we're going to do, like the pinball table has a certain shape, and your score depends on your skill, but it also depends a lot on the pinball table itself, right? They could be harder or not. It could have a hole in the middle, and that's a lot harder than when it doesn't have a hole in the middle, for example. So institutional constraints are constraints that exist because of the way we do things. And you as a policymaker enter into an established landscape of ways of doing things, right? Part of those constraints are going to be internal. They'll have to do with how the state is, and how the state operates. So that's to do direct. That's within what Hugo was describing, right? The organization of the state itself, which puts limits on what policymakers can do. The most obvious example of this is the Constitution, right? Constitutions, if they exist, are laws that are harder to change than other laws, to put a very populist definition of them. And they limit what the government can do, because otherwise it will be declared unconstitutional and some court will strike down your policy, and you cannot do it. You can also not so easily change constitutional things unless you bribe all the opposition with money you get from Odebrecht. But in case you cannot do that, it's hard to change constitutions because you need a big majority for them. It's obvious how that limits things, right? And it's kind of similar with international law. Not to go too deep into that, but certain international laws lock themselves into your constitution. Like, to accept the international law, you need to change your own laws, and that means that you are stuck with that. For example, trade agreements like TMAC are anchored in our own law, and you cannot just pull out of that agreement. Like you could with a peace deal, you could stop, but this you cannot just pull out of it. And TMAC, for example, gives power to companies to sue the government. So now you have to deal with that. And especially the combination of the two is nightmarish, like you have with the energy reform, where it's both locked in the Constitution and those companies are protected by TMAC, which in turn is also locked into the law. So judges have a lot of weapons to hit you with, let's say. Speaking about judges, you also have the separation of power, right? Public policy belongs to the executive part of the government. You have two other ones you need to deal with, right? The legislative part can mess with you, even if they agree with you. It doesn't have to be an agreement on the policy. You don't need a legal change. They can just block you with the budget if you have a minority, and then you cannot do your policies. And they can force you to change your policies, like in the US happens most of the time. Well, typically the ruling party does not have the majority in Congress, and then the other one will impose their agenda on the ruling party through that, or at least alter it. And then you have judicial power, right? That can block people. More about that soon. So those are roadblocks inside of it. Other types of institutional constraints have to do with your own human capital, with your manpower. For policies, you need more than ideas and money. You also need people who actually do them. And those people might or might not be there, right? You can have a plan. And this is especially troublesome if you cannot outsource it. For example, let's say you wanted to build a missile base for the army that shoots missiles, or a warship. But your own army cannot do this because they have no tradition of doing it. But you don't want to outsource this either, because then another country knows how your warship is built, right? And then you don't trust them with it, so you can't have a warship then. That's a problem. Or it could be that you could do it, you just need to do it in a quantity that you don't have. For example, with INSABI. INSABI, what it tries to do in big lines is fairly standard. It's a national health service that exists in many countries, where the government tries to produce, not just pay for, but produce all the healthcare. That is a very solid plan. If you compare it to other countries that exist in many places, most countries that have it don't regret it at all. But you need enormous manpower to do it, because you basically need to replace the private sector overnight, which we didn't have. That's why INSABI, to include its own schools and universities to train nurses and doctors, which takes years, right? Which is why it came out of the gate stumbling and falling over, because you start this policy, it replaces the old one, but it doesn't have all the staff yet to run at maximum capacity, right? And that limited a lot the rollout of INSABI and our health system, because you need 5 years to train people. Same problem you have to a certain extent with Guardia Nacional. You need to train new cops. So that's a constraint on your policy, where you have to either choose to wait or to do it, but do it kind of halfway. Separate from these things, or connected to these things actually, your institutional landscape also determines this is a bit abstract, but it determines the opportunities that people have to mess with you. That depends largely on how your state is organized. Your policy is going to go through certain progress, right? From thinking of it to actually getting it done. You could see it like a roadmap. And on that map, there are going to be various points where people can intervene with you that are usually foreseen. Like it's how things work. For example, in an early step, lobbyists can try to persuade you not to do it, right? And that is not directly constrained, but maybe, like in US, your electoral law works in a way that lobbyists can actually pay you for your campaigns. And then it does become a bit more influential. Or you have, at some point, you will need other lawmakers. So let's say you're the federal government, you make a plan, but to fully implement that plan, you need cooperation from governors who might not like you. The example here is again INSABI. Health delivery is a state level responsibility. Governors play a big role in that. So INSABI is something a governor needs to accept. For that to replace Seguro Popular, you need state level approval, which in Nuevo León we did not have. Bronco said no initially to this, so we couldn't unroll it, which creates a very hard situation for people where one system is ending, but the new one isn't starting yet. So you're kind of in the middle of it. you don't control this, right? And that depends on how your federation works. There could be consultancies. For certain things, consultancies are mandatory. Not consultancies in the way that we had them 2 weeks ago, but in consulting the population. For example, if you do big changes with indigenous people, you should, in theory, consult them on it. We saw this with the Tren Maya, that they did the mini referendum just with indigenous people, right? And they didn't say no, but they could have said no, and that would have stopped your whole policy process, right? In this case, literally in its tracks. Great joke. You also have judges, right? As I said before, judges are very good at messing with policy plans, sometimes in unexpected ways. If you remember at the very beginning of this government, they tried to cut the wages of all magistrates, of everybody who works higher up in the government, right? But they didn't take into account that judges can judge against their own wage cut. For example, they tried to cut the wages of the people of the Human Rights Court, and then the Human Rights Court said that this wage cut was a breach of the human rights, therefore, hitting the table on the table, I still earn 200,000 a month, bitches. And there's nothing they could do because the judge could, judge against his own cut. So that is quite a big problem you have there. And there's many things, right? But how you're organized as a state, if this resistance is going to happen, that's a political factor, right? Has nothing to do with this, but how often it can happen, that has to do with your institutional design, with how the policy process works. And that's often the intention, right? These hindrances are often there by design because you want to limit policymakers. For example, in the case of the indigenous consultancy, these are not bad things, right? Constraints on policy. I'm speaking now from the policymaker's perspective, but often these constraints are desirable, and they're not accidents. Now let's talk about an interesting concept that I don't know if you've had many classes on this before, on path dependency. Have you heard this word before? If you didn't, good, I can teach you something today. My day will have been worthwhile. Okay, path dependency is important. So path dependency, as I write there, in general means that things you've done in the past policy choices, are going to shape what you can do in the future. If you imagine it like a path, right, like the one you see there, especially if there's no concrete, if you walk over a path a lot, it becomes deeper, right? If you in the forest, if you would walk or outside the faculty, if all these little paths, if you walk there a lot, the path becomes more visible, right? If you would imagine it in an extreme scenario, it would become so deep that that's the only way you could go, right? So if you're going down a path for a long while, it gets hard to get off that path, either because you can't or you need to walk back very far and that costs too much time, so you won't do it. You just keep going. Even if it's the wrong direction, you just keep going because going back takes even longer, right? That's also true with policy. Policy is partly path dependent. This is the easiest to understand and path dependent can be positive or negative, right? It could make sure that you cannot stay on that path because it's a dead end, or that you have to stay on it, etc. The most easy way to understand this is in terms of infrastructure. If you build a city in a way that you only have 2 lanes of a road, and then buildings start immediately, like you have no parking, you just have buildings immediately on the road, you can never change that. Especially if this is an important road, and these are like big department stores. Because to nationalize it, you'd have to put so much money into buying those buildings to just get an extra lane that you'll never do it. So that policy decision to make the road so small becomes irreversible. In poor neighborhoods, you just blow down these houses and you say, ha ha, suckers, and you make another road. But in rich neighborhoods, this is hard to do, or in commercial neighborhoods, right? That's path dependency. If you, in the case of the Tren Maya, is a great example. Tren Maya is path dependent literally on the existing path of railroad tracks that already exist. Their plan is to use 95% existing railroads, which is great, but sometimes not, because sometimes that old railroad runs right through a village or next to a village, right? And those people have not seen a train in 100 years, so didn't expect this. But then again, you have to stay there because the plan B is to create a new train track, which would go straight to the jungle, and then the ecologists will be super mad at you. So you're definitely not going to do that. So you're stuck to, in this case, it's a good thing, right? You're stuck to existing railroads. That's path dependency in a very literal sense. It could also be technological. For example, your choices of voltage, or it's very hard to switch from driving on the left to the right side of the road once you've built your infrastructure like that, right? Because you need to change every damn intersection to make that happen. Or if you buy a certain type of tank that doesn't support a certain machine gun, you can never have that machine gun, and blah, blah, blah. And your army will develop in a certain direction because you cannot build it, etc., etc. But it also is true of other types of policies. Certain policies, once you go down the path, are very hard to take back. With privatizations, for example. Some privatizations you can roll back, particularly if they're leases, like, for example, the gas stations are not that hard to roll back because they are concessions given by the government, right? They were privatized. One day they'll become all back of Pemex again because it's just a contract, and that contract can run out. Other privatizations are very hard to roll back because if you, for example, Telcel, right? They sold Telcel for a couple million. Now it's worth hundreds of billions. The government doesn't have hundreds of billions to buy Telcel back, right? It's too late. They could build their own net maybe, but they can never buy it back. So that's you're locked in there. But it can also happen with more social things. For example, certain policies, once they're there and people like them, it's very hard to get rid of them. Even if they're bad, like even if they used to have a function, you had a certain plan for them, they worked, but then that changed, right? For example, you had a certain policy to give money for children because you need more children, and then you have too many children 60 years later, but you cannot quit this thing because all families want it, right? And you're going to lose elections if you stop it. The easiest example is our pensions. Pensions are not really reversible because people count on them. If you would suddenly stop pensions, you can't do that because people made life choices depending on that. Unless you're evil, like Salinas, you can do it. And you just plan to kill your opponents and you don't need to win. But if you're not evil and you care what people think, this is suicide, changing the pension system. And if you do it, you can only do it by screwing young people, like Salinas kind of did. Like he kept the system for people already in it, but young people can never get in it, right? But young people won't remember that he did it because they were babies when he did it. So that's the trade they make, right? But pension systems are quite hard to change because they're very path dependent. You get me. Other things that are path dependent is that you can, by doing certain policies, you can make certain people very powerful, and then you depend on those people. To give you a positive example, that was great. In Belgium, Social Security, both healthcare and unemployment insurance, works via syndicates, works via trade unions. For complex historical reasons, they're not that complex. The unions basically invented these things. Belgium, French, and German unions and UK, they invented Social Security. So they were the first one doing it. So if you got fired and you wanted your money from unemployment, you had to go to the union and the union would pay you, right? Now that's that made it so that basically everybody's with a union. We have like 80% syndicalization rate in Belgium, which is among the highest in the world, right? 80% of people are part of a syndicate. If 80% of people are part of a syndicate, you cannot mess with the syndicates, right? They're very powerful. So you cannot change the system. It might be irrational to have this middleman that hands out the money to the people, right? But that middleman became so powerful because of this that you cannot cut him, which is a good thing. Well, for me, because I'm pro-union, but you can make it in a way that you empower certain actors that they become unavoidable. Yeah, that goes for other sectors as well, of course, insurance industry, etc. And the other way around, you can disempower people by policies that makes it later on very hard to get them back. You could think, for example, to use a very broad example of the consequences of slavery in the US. They still have consequences today, right? Of how neighborhoods are shaped. You still see differences in participation rates, in educational rates, etc. for Black people. That's path-dependent consequence of something that happened a long time ago, right? Or if you spatially, if you segregate people, if you build your city in a way that the poor people and the immigrants live in a different part of the city, that is very hard to take back, because you now by design are going to concentrate poverty, and you know that will make it, that will have impacts on everything else. We'll get to that when we talk about poverty. And lastly, the experience that people have with policies in itself can also cause path dependency. If something goes wrong once horribly, people will remember that, even if it's in general a good thing, right? Let's say that 100 countries did it, it went only wrong in your country, but you won't do it again, right? Because it went wrong. An easy example of this is re-election in Mexico. We are one of the last countries on earth that doesn't have re-election. We don't realize this, right? We're like, yeah, but in America don't have re-election either. Oh wait, they do. But because of Porfirio Diaz, there's still in every student knows this. They drill this in your head in primary school, and so you will never make that mistake again, right? That's path dependency. That's in people's collective memory, and that's very hard to change now. Do you understand the concept? Okay. Good, because I'm almost out of breath. Now let's talk to bridge a bit with the topic of politics, right? This is not as important as path dependency, but your institutional design, although that is not politics, shapes politics, and politics shapes policy. What I mean by that is the way things are organized on an electoral level will impact how politicians will behave, and that will impact what type of choices they make, regardless of who they are or what they believe, right? This is regardless of ideology. That's a deep thing that we're not going to go into very deep, but just some examples of that. If your system is majoritarian, that means that to do things, you just need a simple majority. And some systems force this majority. So that means that if you're the biggest party, you're going to get a majority anyway. So let's say you score 35, but then the electoral system will correct that to 51, right? We have a little bit of that, where bigger parties get more, get extra seats than small ones, right? Most countries try to boost majorities to make it easier to rule. Anyway, in that type of systems, you can have faster decision making, because either people are for or they're against. There's nothing to talk about. We just vote, right? Okay, we got majority, then we're doing it. Oh, we don't have a majority, we move on to something else. Our system is kind of like that. That makes it easier to do things. While if you have a consensus-based system, where, for example, you need large majorities to pass things, or you have many parties, like in Belgium, and you need a coalition of 8, 9 parties to make a government, Now you're going to slow down everything, right? So certain policies might not be interesting, or more daring policies, for example, are much less likely to happen in a system like that. On the other hand, policies that screw with minorities are also less likely to happen because you have a lot of room for protest in such a system, etc. But also in how your elections work. This is a bit interesting. As you know from other courses, right, you have proportional elections, which means that for every so many thousand votes, you get a delegate, right? And you have, let's call it seat elections, first past the post election. I don't know how you have many names for it, but basically you need to win your district and then you get the delegate, right? We have both in Mexico. So you have to win your own district. And if you get second place, you get nothing. And we have plurinominales, where if in your voting group, which is basically your east, northwest side of the country, if you get enough votes, you get a delegate. We are weird in the sense that we have a combination. Most countries is one or the other. We're not weird, we are maybe superior to them. But anyway, most is one or the other. And that's very influential because they work, the politics of them work very different. If you have a local delegate system, you need to win counties, right? So you need to convince certain people. And getting second place is no use. So there is absolutely no use to appealing to people that live in a place you cannot win, right? If you get 0 or you get 40%, that doesn't matter. You need 50, yes? But the districts you can win, you need to win at all costs. So in this type of environments, politicians will often be very clientelist. And they'll say, okay, we're going to help you, and not you. And you guys have to support me or else I'm going to stop helping you, right? You're going to only focus on certain people and certain regions, typically where you're from, right? Because those are the people who elect you. While if you have a proportional system, what you need are votes, any votes, right? Anybody's vote is worth the same to you. Also people that live at the other side of the country. So here you're going to see politicians be much less locally focused and try to appeal to the majority as a whole, right? Try to make policies that benefit everyone. Again, to the disadvantage that they're not helping their own region, for example, right? That they're going to sacrifice local interests to win over the hearts of people in general. Do you understand how this can influence policies?
Yes, because you can direct the benefits to, as you mentioned, one group of people or the other. So it changes your interests based on, well, political outcomes.
Mm-hmm. It can also, in a way, it can backfire. To go a bit deep, like in US, for example, the north center of the country, well, the whole center of the country, votes Republican, right? Especially these rural places. And you could argue that that means that they will always get attention because Republicans need them, right? It also means that if Democrats are in power, they're screwed because Democrats cannot win them anyway, so they're not going to try. But if you do that long enough, that in itself becomes path dependent. And you, like Republicans know they're going to win, so they stop caring too. So then nobody cares at the end because you're going to vote Republican anyway, right? So again, that's a path dependency within one of these shapes. But that shapes politics. Now let's talk about politics a bit more directly, right? Here, my two friends, the Jolly Brothers. It were fun times. Should have been around. We talked a lot about politics. I'm going to keep this one a bit shorter. Right? One constraint that exists is political feasibility. That doesn't look like a hard constraint, like if politicians think it's a good idea for them electorally. But at the end of the day, politics is its own ecosystem with its own dynamics. And governments do need to pay attention to what will get them votes or not. Yes, that's not a hard constraint in the way that budget is a constraint. the way that the Constitution is a constraint. Like theoretically, it's not as strong, but in practice, this has the same power. And at the end of the day, policymakers, especially if they're electable, like in US, where judges and I don't know judges, but where attorneys and police chiefs, etc., are also electable, right? You have to really think about the political feasibility of things. You need to both please the electorate, that's one thing, and you need to be able to be strong enough to beat any resistance coming your way. And both could go wrong. You could both think, oh, if I do that, I will lose my electoral base and our party will lose, so I'm not going to do it. I cannot do it. Or I want to do this, but I know I cannot win the fight. They're going to get too much resistance. Like I could beat them all, but that would cost me too much money, or I will look authoritarian or whatever. So I'm just going to avoid this fight altogether, right? Even if it's the right plan. So that's how political feasibility can limit government actions, can constrain public policy. Of course, this is not absolute, as I said, because you need a majority, right, to win, but that majority can change. You can switch majorities. You would have a choice. For example, I'm going to piss off these people or those people. Oh, well, screw these people. I'm going to go with those people, right? And you still have a majority. So you can shuffle this around. You can realign the people that you're working for, right? For example, the Republicans have screwed up with Latinos. So they lost them as a base, but maybe they can get them back by appealing to Catholicism and then to, you know, to more conservative things. But if they do that, they will lose they will lose the Trump base, right? So you can still make choices here. But if you do so, it's important. Well, you should try to gather knowledge of how this will fall with the electorate. You should take into account the notions of the people, right? What they believe. For example, what AMLO did last week or 2 weeks ago with the amnesty for prisoners is politically a very brave thing to do, because people hate prisoners. Why? Because they did things wrong. That's why they're in prison in the first place, right? So to help prisoners is not self-evident. Prisoners cannot vote, so they're not going to give you back your lost political capital, right? And in many places, you cannot vote even if you're out of prison in the US, in some states. And, well, people hate them. So that's a lot of political feasibility going against that, right? And if you do it, you need to frame it very carefully. You need to say, oh, but if we don't get more people out of prison, there will be a COVID epidemic within prisons, and that's dangerous for the other people too. Or they cost us too much money. I hate these prisoners too, but I hate paying for their food even more. So I'm going to get all these old people out, right? So they can fetch on their own. Let them live in the streets. Like you can have some machismo talk and still get it done, right? You just need to appeal to how people feel about it. You need to speak the right language to get over these obstacles. If you don't, they're very hard constraints. You will be punished for it. It also depends on your own credibility, what you can get away with. You will often see in politics, if you pay attention, that not so much in 21st century politics, but in previous ages of like big, strong politicians, that people of the opposite ideology were the only ones to do hard changes in one direction. What do I mean with this? If you wanted to reform the syndicates without having a riot, somebody like your president would be one of the few people who could do it because he has so much credit with these syndicates, right? They believe him. If Peña Nieto would try to do it, they would immediately fight him over it. The same way as you saw, for example, in Israel. This is an old example that you might not be able to get, but you used to have a president called Sharon, who was from the military, and he was very hardline guy. But because he was hard and was kind of macho and seen like that, he was the only one ever who stopped the illegal settlements. Because people didn't dare to say, oh, you're against Israel. You just slap them in the face like, shut up, I did all of this myself. I was doing this before you were born, blah, 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 blah. So he has so much credibility that he can do something that goes against his own base, right? Well, if a left guy would try to do it, they would burn him. Does that make sense? So your credibility also matters in how much you can deal with, or how much you can tempt political feasibility. As I said, helping people isn't always good, because other people might hate those people you're helping, right? So it's not as easy as, oh, I'm doing this for people, they're going to vote for me. There's larger consequences to this. Helping immigrants, usually a bad idea. Helping prisoners, usually a bad idea. Helping any type of criminal, bad idea. Helping men aged 40, bad idea, because they're supposed to do it themselves, right? Helping children, good idea. Helping women, good idea. Helping old women, even better, right? Widows, ding, 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 you won all prizes of likability, right? Orphan widows, orphans that later become widows, you know, great. Everybody wants to help them. So it depends a bit on the audience you have. And lastly, policymakers need to overcome certain elites, right? We already talked about the veto players, but veto players are foreseen in the system. Like the system gives them the power to stop you, like a judge has that power. But you also have elites outside of the system that can try to mess with you, right? Industrial elites, for example. How much they can make a good idea politically unfeasible depends, of course, on how close they are to you. If they have a lot of access to the policymakers, if they have a lot of lobbyists, etc., if they're connected, if they're family, then it becomes a lot harder to cross them. If you have a system where you don't care about other people, if you're a bit more dictatorial, then these elites don't matter that much to you, right? We'll get more into that when we talk about participation, how you can block the government, etc., etc. But there are it depends on your electoral system too. But some people can, for example, threaten you. They can say, oh, well, if you're going to do that, then I will leave the country and I'll take all my businesses with me, right? Or as you saw now with the Gaspi and the Star, oh, well, then we're going to strike, or we're not going to, we're going to try to boycott it. Depends how much power they have over you and how elite you are. If you have nothing to do with the elites, you're not their friends, you don't care that much, right? But if you got your job because of them, then you care more. In general, if there's anything you could say about this in general, the people who defend the way things are will usually win versus the people who want to change things. When it comes to political feasibility, there's a lot more risk in changing things than in not changing them for politicians. Why? Because the way people already understand the way things are, and people know what benefit they get from that, right? You know, if you are a pensioner, that you have the pension because you see it in your bank account each month. If I'm going to change that, you don't necessarily know what's going to happen. So you have the element of the safer option. That's one thing psychologically, but also you know that you're implied. While with a new policy, the people that will benefit are not necessarily aware that they're going to benefit from this, right? Because they don't follow politics. They don't know this plan is in the air, so they're not going to support it. But if they already get it, they know it for sure, right? So the audience of an existing policy is always bigger, or is always more active than the potential audience of a new policy. Because not everybody in the potential audience knows that they're in there. I don't know, maybe I'm not making sense at all. You understand what I'm trying to say? So that gives a kind of structural advantage to keeping things the way they are. as far as goes political feasibility. Doesn't mean change doesn't happen, right? It happens all the time. But still, a lot of change gets blocked too because of things like that. And these constraints will convince policymakers not to do certain things. And that's my last slide on constraints. So what questions do you have, dear students?
I'm still processing because there were a lot of information, so I don't have any question for now.
Was it too much information? These are 5 chapters of a book, of different books that I kind of mashed into each other. I've been reading like since last time I spoke to you. I've just been reading all the time. But is this too much?
No, but like they were many examples.
Okay.
So I'm still like processing what's going on.
Things are technical, right? And when you talk about policy in general, yeah, there's many examples that you don't necessarily know about. So that's more difficult. When we get into specific types of policy, it gets a bit easier because it's narrower.
I think it was pretty clear. I mean, it was a lot of information, but clear. Mostly because of the examples.
Do you perceive policy as very constrained? Like do you have the idea that the government can do whatever? If you look at Mexican politics, right, do you see a government that is very free in what it does, or do you see it very constrained?
I think that right now, like the government really has too much power. So
Okay.
I think that if they want to do something, they would be more like free to do it.
And
Because
okay,
I'm sorry.
how does it have too much power?
I mean, because public opinion is still like with the president and the party in general. So they are still able to do well or to implement some policies that might not be liked by some sectors of the population, mostly elites. So they still have this liberty to do policies that would not, I mean, that will affect negatively to the elites, but possibly to the people. Like for example, the creation of the gas company.
Yes.
Like it's not good for the gas companies, but it's good, I think, for the people. And they do not care if they made a paro that affected the people, because it would be just like affecting them a little bit, like some days, and then it would, I mean, the gas provided by the state would replace those gaseros. So they took that liberty to piss them off because they know that they are too powerful, that they will overcome them. I mean, they will overcome their resistance.
And do you perceive, if you talk about that, do you perceive that leadership is very concerned with political feasibility or not?
Not really. I mean, I know that obviously the president like takes in count the risks of the policies he's making, but I think he has, I mean, since he has the public opinion on his side and almost the political majority, so he takes some risks in the policies he makes. But he's, and the political feasibility is not a very big concern for him, I think.
And do you guys in general think that this is connected to more to him or to just how Mexico works, in the sense that it's fairly presidential, and compared to US, for example, power, it's still possible to do things in Mexico because power is centralized enough, let's say, to have fluent policy. Or you think it's a personal thing?
No, I think that, well, personally, I think that it's more institutional but it wouldn't be the same if it was a different president, for example.
Okay. What do you girls think, or you, Miss Mariana?
I think that we are really constrained in police making because, for example, with big issues like security, you can say like, okay, we're gonna make the state more secure, but you have like really big problems like the narcos, or you are dealing with like the other politicians are related to them, so you cannot attack them directly. You need to be really strategic in those things. And no, I don't think it. But for example, in Mexico City with the metro, like okay, now we're gonna have like a better metro. But now you need to rebuild all the lines, and that is going to take a lot of time, a lot of money, and it's not going to be like a solution, a fast solution. So I don't think it's easy to like propose something and make it and people are happy now. I think it's really hard, and you need to like be strategic and choose to whom are you going to make happy and choose your new enemies and all that stuff. Yeah.
Choose your new enemies. Okay.
Yeah.
Any additions to this?
I think that people in general doesn't realize how hard it is to make decisions in politics, because at the end of the day, like the policies are all about choices and trying to do the better thing. But like at the end of the day, you can't make everyone happy because there's always someone who is going to make you look bad. But like at the end of the day, that's also part of the power. Like I do something and I know that someone is going to say, "Oh no, you're wrong." Like
And
for
then,
example,
and then you bribe that person.
and then you what?
You bribe that person, or you disappear them. That's the Mexican way.
Yeah, that's true. Or you kill him or
Yeah.
something. Yeah. Yeah, but like for example, I think that it's more like how Mexico work, because like if right now the president like let's imagine that it's Anaya, like people will still against him, telling that he's a conservative and he's a privileged white cis man or something like that. Like presidents are not like they at the end of the day they will have some critiques, but I think that it's more important that they have a good like team that make them good policies that at the end of the day are better. Like they are doing the good job for the people, not necessarily the president. So yeah.
Okay, I don't really get the Anaya example, but he's adorable. Now he has longer hair.
Like for example, Mariana said that it's because it's AMLO, but I'm saying that at the end of the day, it's like it doesn't matter who president is in power. Like obviously because he's AMLO and because he's from Morena and comunismo and socialismo. Well, like people are more scared, but like it's really not big of the deal. Because of the
Anaya would have a lot of problems, because start of all, he would not have a majority. If he would win, he would almost certainly win with a minority. So then he would have to work. Well, he's already with the PRI now. If you bring it in the present, right? Would have to deal with Movimiento or Morena then, and he would have a lot of legal constraints that would stop him. As far as what Hugo said, I'm very uncertain on this. On the one hand, like to what extent the president cares about political feasibility. On the one hand, it sometimes looks like he doesn't care at all. And if he thinks it's right, he's just gonna do it. Especially if there's some religious connection to it, like, I don't know, helping thieves or things like that. He thinks he has like almost biblical duty to do. He'll do it, even if it looks very bad. On the other hand, and that's definitely how it looks like inside the party. Everybody's always like, no, don't do this. Like, you're gonna hate us. It does anyway. But on the other hand, you've seen a lot that this government, if you ignore AMLO and you just look at what the government does, is very responsive to criticism. They have a new plan, people complain, and they'll change it 2 days later. That happens a lot. Like they come out, we'll stop all outsourcing. And then like rich people like have a little talk with them, and then 3 days later, like, we'll stop most outsourcing. And you know, they will change a little bit the thing. And sometimes they get things wrong. Like they'll cut something in CONACYT, and then people complain, and then 2 days later, like, oh, we meant we're gonna cut it next year. They backtrack quite often on their strong positions. So I'm never sure if they care, if they don't care. Maybe there are different people who care. Different faces. Okay. Any other questions you have?
I have one question, but it's
Okay.
not really about the topic.
Okay.
But you mentioned it in the first minutes of the class about the Coneval results.
Yes.
And my question is how much it is, or how not much it's the percentage, puntos percentuales, I don't know how to say in English, that we gain of poverty.
See, I should know this literally because I looked at it yesterday, but I'm gonna be 1% off. All right. If you give a 1% margin, it's, I think, around 51% now. It depends. There's different ways of measuring poverty. In the most strict one, like the worst one, it would be somewhat over 50%. This is 2 or 3% higher, 2% higher than it was, 2.5% than it used to be in the last measurement, 2018, which is still better than it was on the Calderon. But so basically, that's the, you know, this was measured 2020 during the first lockdown. So this is the massive loss of income, right? This was the moment where economy went down. So how bad that is, you would have to see more statistics on it to see what that really means in terms of change. It was unconceivable poverty would go down in the pandemic, right? That would make no sense at all. It would go up. But it makes it very hard to measure impact of policies because you don't know now, right? Because maybe, you know, maybe the pandemic happened and the policy was bad, but, you know, the pandemic kind of washes over that result. So we'll have to see in 4 years and 2 years what the next measurement says. So it's basically back to the levels where it always was. That's how you could say it. Which is better than I expected. It's better than everybody expected. I remember a year ago, prediction was poverty would rise with 10%. So 2% raise is all right compared to that. But it's, you know, you don't want to see that. And extreme poverty went up too, by a little bit more, I think 3% more. So that's also bad. That answers your question a bit. When we get to poverty, I'm going to give you all the numbers. So in like a month, when we start talking about that subject, I'm going to have a lecture about poverty. I'm going to have statistics showing you the evolutions. Okay, that's that then. I will see you girls and guys Wednesday. Take care.
Yes.
Goodbye. Thank
All right.
you.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.